whole point about end-of-life care is that you matter until you die. The dose that was in her system was way above what would have been expected.
Here we had a nurse who all of a sudden appears to have killed a patient. Why has that happened?
She's getting targeted. It's not just a threatening letter, it's a card shaped as a coffin.
It clearly opened our eyes to who we were dealing with. This wasn't really a typical sort of case. Residents of nursing homes dying in suspicious circumstances are quite rare. My name is Chris Simmons. I'm a retired Chief Superintendent from Northumbria Police. I was contacted at home as the on-call Senior Investigating Officer. I got a phone call to say that there'd been an incident at Aidan House and a resident had died. Aidan House is a nursing home which is located in Bensham, Gateshead. It had 18 bedrooms, and at the time it had 10 patients who were predominantly elderly men and women who were receiving medical care from the nursing staff and from the care staff.
My name's Dr. Sarah Jarvis, and I'm a GP. Alice Grant was 84. That's not unusual by care home standards, but even by care home standards, she would have been particularly vulnerable because not only had she had 2 strokes and therefore was likely to be very physically incapacitated, she also had dementia, so she had mental incapacity as well.
She was widowed. She'd been in care for about 5 years. She focused on her family and sort of spending family time together. It's a very difficult decision to make, to put a loved one in care. Families have to balance the practicalities of looking after elderly and sick relatives with their other challenges and demands of day-to-day life. But sometimes people need the specialist attention from nurses and medical staff that they can only receive in a care facility.
We know she's had 2 strokes, and the thing about Alice is that she requires up to 30 minutes of care every 2 hours. I'm Donna Youngs. I'm a professor of investigative psychology. It's a really intensive care demand that she has because of her age and the effects of the stroke.
Alice Grant at the time would use a food supplement, a chocolate drink. That's the only way that Alice could be fed. Alice was a woman who had a lot of serious illnesses. She could die at any time. So she was a lady who was very, very close to her natural death. The senior care assistant was obviously monitoring Alice Grant throughout the day, as were the other employees as well. Alice was found to be in an uncomfortable position, lying on her back, having difficulties breathing.
Mrs. Grant seemed to be in significant discomfort. She was gasping for breath, she was propped up on one pillow, and she seemed very uncomfortable.
Eventually, when the senior care assistant went in at about 3:30 that same day, she found Alice Grant wasn't breathing and she had died.
The doctors put this down to old age, infirmity.
All the suspicions came from 4 members of staff who were on duty at the time that the events unfolded. The police were contacted during the early hours of Saturday the 13th of May by one of the cleaning staff, who was one of the 4 members of staff who had concerns. It was important that all those significant witnesses were interviewed so you could get the chronology of the events and you could build up a clear and accurate picture of what actually happened. When we interviewed the staff, they gave a detailed account of events that day. We were able to pinpoint where they were and what they were doing between the vital times, which was between about 9 o'clock in the morning and 3:30 when Alice died. The senior care assistant arrived into Alice's room. She immediately saw that Alice Grant was struggling to breathe, but she was struck by a smell that she smelled straight away. It was a pungent odour, and she recognised the smell immediately.
Epinephrine is a brand name. It's also known as chlormethiazole, and it's not uncommonly used for instance, agitation. It's very difficult to miss, and it doesn't really smell like anything else. So once you've smelt it, you can recognise it quite easily. It's related to vitamin B, vitamin B1, and that means it has a sort of sulphur-like smell, perhaps like bad eggs. Epinephrine was used fairly regularly for patients who were agitated and who were distressed by their agitation in settings like care homes. And indeed, Mrs. Grant had been given epinephrine before. However, on this occasion, there was nothing to suggest that she should be given it.
Alice Grant wasn't actually prescribed the drug epinephrine, which reinforced their suspicions.
There was a possible allegation made. Maybe there was foul play. It's not uncommon for people who are working under stress to use dark humour to an extent. But the idea that anybody would say, I wish I could give her something to help her on her way, is not something that any healthcare professional should dream of saying. It's particularly chilling. She just said, she's going to die anyway. Look at her, she's blue. All nurses need to be two main things. Firstly, very professional, and secondly, compassionate. And that is nowhere more the case than in a care home where you are looking after the most vulnerable members of society.
Alison Firth was born in Irvine in Scotland. She went into nursing following her mother's footsteps.
She'd been a nurse since she was about 20. She was a married wife and mother of a 3-year-old girl.
Alison was one of 5 nurses who worked round the clock, providing 24-hour care to the residents. She was a registered general nurse, and as the nurse, she would be responsible for looking after and treating all of the residents who were in Aden House. She would also be responsible for directing the care staff who supported her, the care assistants and the other staff who were on the premises. She had a lot of responsibility. As the duty nurse, would have been in charge of running Aden House, and her decisions would have been the ones taken. Alison Firth was the day shift nurse. She came in, I think it was at 8 o'clock that morning, to start her tour of duty. There was 4 other staff. Alison and 2 care assistants started the day doing the rounds, waking up the residents and just attending to their medical needs and generally looking after them.
When the cleaner went into Alice Grant's room, she found that Alison Firth was standing over her and that she could see the syringe.
She was feeding a food supplement, which is the only way that Alice Grant could be fed.
The cleaner remembers one thing, and that's that this brown substance that she saw Alison giving to Alice Grant had a really, really strong and unpleasant smell to it.
She was propped up on one pillow and she seemed very uncomfortable. Even the cleaner recognised that it might help to prop her up further, but Alison Firth was having none of that.
Then we get this bizarre, dismissive comment. We get Alison Firth saying, there's no need for that, she's going to die anyway. Look how blue she is. It's a comment that turns Alice Grant, this 84-year-old woman, into an object. It's a comment as if she's not there, as if she can't hear. It's a comment that just dismisses the life that she's got remaining.
Alison Firth was invited into the police station as a voluntary attender, so we could get her account of what happened, and then we could evaluate her account against what we were being told by the witnesses.
When police bring up the apparent comment she made about wanting to give something to Alice Grant to help her along her way, Firth just dismisses this as workplace banter.
She said quite simply that she fed Alice in the normal way, and that if anyone's put any drugs into her food supplement meal, then it's been somebody else.
Alison Firth doesn't seem to take the accusations too seriously.
My role as the senior officer was to evaluate what was being said during the interviews, and to take a step back and contrast that with the evidence that we were gaining from the witness interviews. Alison Firth asked the care assistant to go and get the senior care assistant, and when the senior care assistant arrived into Alice's room, she immediately saw that Alice Grant was struggling to breathe. She smelt the heminevrin on Alice's breath, around her clothes, and in the room generally, and also the window had been opened as if to make the smell go away. She also noticed that Alison Firth was holding a medicine bottle, which the witness knew to be a heminevrin medicine bottle, and Alison Firth was holding it down by her side. Alison Firth left the room and said she was going to clean all of the utensils, the beaker, the syringe, and the staff found that unusual because she rarely cleaned things up after her. She usually left it to other staff. Alison Firth's account didn't change. She was at a point where she was starting to blame other members of staff. There was a lot of inconsistencies in her voluntary accounts, contrasted with the witness evidence from the 4 staff who were on duty at the time. We got to the point where it was quite clear that there was strong suspicions that Alison Firth had a hand in Alice Grant's death. I've made a policy decision to have Alison Firth formally arrested for the murder of Alice Grant. The suspicions were such in my mind that I was very, very clear that she had done something seriously wrong here.
She denies what's happened.
The other main line of inquiry at this early stage of the investigation was the medical evidence. So a Home Office pathologist would have been called and arrangements would have been made for Alice Grant to be examined by him.
The post-mortem didn't show anything out of the ordinary.
It then required longer-term medical and scientific inquiries with toxicologists and scientists.
In other words, looking for samples specifically, in this case, of heminevrin.
Alison Firth's account didn't change. We got to a point where we couldn't progress the investigation any further, and we made a decision that she would be subject to what we called police bail. Whilst Alison Firth was on bail, we could progress the forensic evidence and the further medical evidence, and also the additional longer-term background inquiries. Here we had a nurse who all of a sudden appears to have killed a patient. Why has that happened? What's been going on in her life that led that to happening? Where's she been before? What sort of work has she been doing before? So we clearly need to take a close look at what was going on. We built up a picture of what Alison Firth was like as a person, as a nurse, as someone who was in charge of Aiden House at the time she was on duty. And that showed not a very healthy picture.
Repeatedly, people who'd worked with Alison Firth said that she didn't care about her appearance. She didn't care about looking smart. She would wear dirty, stained T-shirts. This really reflected a lack of care for herself, but also a lack of respect for the people that she was looking after.
There's no doubt, there's lots of indicators here that we've got somebody who's got really a very unimpressive personality. She's a little bit slovenly, she's a bit messy, she's always a bit late, she's careless.
She was lazy in her day-to-day professional life, and she wasn't a good advert for the honourable profession of nurses. She had a history of short-term employments all over England and Scotland.
She'd been a nurse for 16 years, but she'd worked in 27 different roles. So this was a woman who'd moved very much more often than you would expect somebody to move, and you have to ask yourself why she didn't have any continuity. Many, many nurses and doctors, members of the caring profession, will build up long-term relationships with their patients. You will often expect people to work in the same place for many years at a time because of the nature of those personal relationships. That was the opposite of what clearly happened in Alison Firth's case.
Alison Firth had been a nurse for nearly 16 years, and unfortunately her reputation as a nurse wasn't a good one. We also established that she had a very checkered history, patterns of sickness, sleeping on duty, and also lying about all sorts of things. Lying about the reasons why she couldn't attend work.
She's somebody who's obviously not particularly committed to this line of work.
It was quite revealing, and it was quite illuminating as to what kind of person we were dealing with. There was an incident at her home address. Alison Firth and her husband were at home with their 3-year-old child, and there were bricks thrown through the window. But it also led to a number of incidents which happened over the weeks whilst Alison Firth was on bail. Altogether, she reported 9 incidents to the police. We think, upon assessment, that that was genuine. By some means, the press had obtained a picture of Alison Firth and published it. That isn't something that the investigation authorised or endorsed. At that stage of the investigation, you don't name suspects until they're actually charged. On one occasion, she reported finding a cut-out coffin on the windscreen of her car, with a photograph that she said had been obtained from her workplace. She reported a particular car with a registration number which was linked back to the street where another member of staff lived. She reported this car driving suspiciously around her home.
Alison Firth tells police that she's getting targeted, that she's getting picked on.
She was frequently blaming one of the members of staff from Aiden House as being responsible for these incidents. She reported a number of incidents where there'd been attempted fires started in and around her porch and in her garden.
All the allegations that she tells police are happening as a result of her name being exposed in the media.
We came to a point where we assessed these incidents and we had a covert camera installed so we could actually monitor Alison Firth's home.
The surveillance camera reveals something really very interesting.
It actually showed Alison Firth herself squirting some sort of liquid around her porch.
What we're seeing is somebody who's going to a lot of effort to try and defend herself, who's setting up scenarios, who's creating elaborate stories about what is happening to her. It's a remarkably energetic response from Alison Firth that we actually see. And this is because she's absolutely, wholeheartedly embracing being the victim. She's very comfortable in this role. She's the one that everybody's attacking, everybody's asking too much of. So we see her actually showing more energy and dynamism and inventiveness than she normally shows in her everyday life in response to being outed in the media.
When she was arrested and interviewed and presented with the covert evidence, she admitted some of the incidents that had occurred. She was still continuing her attempts to divert attention away from herself and to put the focus of the investigation onto the staff at Aden House. When she was eventually returned to her police bail, she was further interviewed again, and during this later interview she admitted some more of the incidents that had occurred outside of her house. There was about 4 or 5 that she had admitted. I think they were just the actions of a desperate woman. They were just cries for help, shouts of desperation. We discovered that Alison had been falsifying her timesheets when she was a nurse in the Newcastle area, and she received a police caution for that.
It really does speak to a complete lack of professionalism. Even 25 years ago, there were regulations in place to try and ensure that people who were looking after the most vulnerable people in care homes and in hospital indeed did have high levels of professionalism. But there is only so much that can be done. References can only tell you so much. It's important to remember that it's not always easy to get staff for care homes. The caring professions, sadly, have had a recruitment crisis for years and years. Unfortunately, care homes who are desperate for staff because their residents need care may have to take somebody's word for it.
If a member of staff lies to the home through their application form, then it's very difficult for nursing homes to actually overcome those acts of deceit. She admitted all of the evidence that we'd gained regarding the lies she had been telling to previous employees about why she couldn't attend work, namely that her mother-in-law had died or her father had died, and also on one occasion that she'd been raped. She admitted that all these were lies.
What she's revealing is the underlying thinking of somebody who believes that they can manipulate, coerce, cheat their way out of any situation or any demands on them.
She admitted that she'd failed to disclose her police caution for falsifying timesheets whilst as a nurse, and she also admitted the fact that her mother and brother had been part and parcel of the false references that she'd used to try and gain many of the jobs she applied for.
We have somebody who indeed has shown this pattern of cheating type behaviour.
It clearly opened our eyes to who we were dealing with. On the substantive issue of Alice Grant's death, she maintained her original position that she didn't deliberately put the heminevrin into the food supplement drink and administer it to Alice Grant. She maintained her innocence on that point. One, you are accusing a medical professional of a serious crime, and two, the issues around proving that Alice Grant was murdered at the hands of Alison Firth as opposed to dying naturally was a medical challenge. When the forensic evidence was obtained, it showed that there was the presence of heminevrin in Alice Grant's blood, in her liver, in her urine, in her stomach contents, and in her mouth swab.
Not only was it found in Mrs. Grant's system when it shouldn't have been, but the levels were way above the levels that we would expect if somebody had been given it as a therapeutic treatment.
The normal therapeutic dose would be about 5 millilitres of heminevrin syrup. So we're talking about a dose at the least 20 millilitres. The medical evidence clearly showed that whilst that level of drug administration wouldn't be fatal to a normal healthy person, to Alice Grant, who we must remember was 4'9" tall, weighed 5 or 6 stone, and she was a frail old lady who was in serious ill health. Well, that level of overdose to her caused her serious harm and ultimately respiratory depression and death. During interview, when she was being pressed as to whether she had administered drugs to Alice Grant on the day of her death, she said that she may have indicated on the log that she'd administered the drug, but she couldn't remember if she had, and indeed she may not have done. Another thing that was revealed during this part of the investigation was the fact that Alison Firth, between the times of about 12:30 and 3:30, failed to comply with the Aden House policy of notifying the GP that one of the patients was dying. She deemed it unnecessary, which is quite bizarre.
When you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have a great deal of empathy and they come face to face with people who are weaker than themselves, it exposes that empathy deficit all the more.
She just assumed that Alice was dying anyway. There was no need. There is no doubt that as a registered general nurse, Alison Firth would have known that the administration of a sedative like heminevrin to Alice Grant would have caused her serious harm. When the trial came about, there was a lot of public interest in the case, clearly because a medical professional had been accused of murder. The prosecution had to develop a strategy as to what her potential motive was. Bearing in mind that Alison Firth had never admitted at any stage that she had deliberately killed Alice Grant, the first factor was Alice Grant was a demanding patient that took up her time. And that demand fell predominantly on the nurse, because the nurse is the only person who's qualified to administer medicines and give that level of care. Given that we'd already established that Alison Firth was quite lazy, lacked professionalism, I mean, she'd previously been caught sleeping on duty in a previous job, she previously didn't attend work and went on the sick quite frequently. This presentation of a demanding patient clearly wasn't to her liking, and we felt in presenting the case that this was a strong part of the motive.
Alison Firth's attitude was, well, she's on the way out, let's leave her to it, and it doesn't matter if she suffers as she goes. That is truly shocking.
When you have somebody like that, somebody who doesn't have a genuine empathetic response to other human beings suffering, and they are continually in an environment where they are exposed to pain and suffering, it becomes the norm to underplay that, to minimize that.
Another part of the motive that was put forward by the prosecution was the fact that Alison Firth was, in her words, hacked off at the decision of Aden House to change its designation from a nursing home to a residential home, because this would require Alison Firth to either be made redundant or to be redeployed in another establishment of the company. The main prosecution witnesses were the care staff who were on duty with Alison at the time that Alice Grant was administered Heminevrin. And that's the senior care worker who actually saw Alison holding the Heminevrin medicine bottle, and also the other care staff who saw the various occasions when Alison Firth had her lying on her back and making quite sickening comments about her dying quickly. Now, all those witnesses, and there were 4 in total, gave evidence in accordance with their statements, and that was a strong part of the prosecution case. Another group of witnesses who were in court involved those who painted a picture about what type of person Alison Firth was in terms of her conduct as a nurse, in terms of her sickness record, in terms of her character. When put together with the actions of Firth on the day of Alice's death, clearly showed that there was a compelling case. In terms of her defence, Alison Firth actually did concede that she had deliberately administered the drug. But she said she did it for a good motive, namely to ease her suffering.
At the end of life, there is something called the doctrine of double effect. What that means is that if a healthcare professional gives somebody a medication purely to relieve their suffering, so a good example may be a patient in excruciating pain, you give them a strong painkiller purely to relieve their suffering, and that suppresses their respiration, their breathing, so they stop breathing and die as a result. If your only reason for giving it was to relieve pain, then you are not culpable. You can't be found guilty on that basis.
This clearly was not the case, and was something that she was not authorised or entitled to do as a registered nurse. The jury rejected that defence and found her guilty of murder. Murder on the basis that she deliberately made a conscious decision to take the Heminevrin out of the medical cabinet, apply it to the chocolate drink that she fed Alice Grant with, and did that in the knowledge that that drug would cause her serious harm. There is no way that you could say she did that out of kindness.
Alison Firth may have thought that she would get away with this murder because she was giving Mrs. Grant a drug which was fairly widely used in nursing homes at the time, and a drug which Mrs. Grant had been given before when she was agitated.
In her mind, I suspect there were grey areas. She could try and talk her way out of it, deflect blame on other people.
The judge's remarks are incredibly perceptive. They're right on the money. He says, you murdered Mrs. Grant, so you did not have to put yourself to the trouble of caring for her in the future.
They aren't the actions of kindness, they're the actions of an uncaring nurse who clearly didn't want to look after Alice Grant because of the demands she made upon her.
When Alison Firth, with her undeveloped sense of empathy and personality came face to face with a situation that demanded so much more of her. Her reaction could have been to rise to that challenge, but her reaction was instead to just remove the challenge.
We're dealing with a victim who was very, very close to dying naturally in any case. But in my view, that didn't matter a jot. She was a victim of a murder, and she was entitled to the full protection of the law at that stage of her life, notwithstanding her medical condition.
Fundamentally, you must believe that every patient's life is valuable until the very last moment of their lives. When you're looking after somebody at the end of their life, we must do everything we can to ensure that their passing is comfortable. Alison Firth clearly showed that she had no interest, no compassion, no professionalism, and put her own selfish interests above that of one of the most vulnerable people imaginable.
But for the actions of the senior care assistant, the senior care assistants recognised that smell immediately as the drug hemineverin. The actions of Alison Firth may have gone undetected.
It's very clear from the court case and from the judges summing up that this was nothing to do with relieving this vulnerable person's suffering. It was to relieve the workload on a lazy, selfish, self-centred murderer.